And yeah, let's just get started. Can you all see the presentation okay? Fostering co-creation of a world that works for all?
Looks good.
All right. Yeah, so we talk about today is an architecture and a platform for supporting self-organizing transformational change at global scale. And sort of the visual of that is a network of networks spanning the globe, initially focused on supporting those on the growing edge of evolutionary change. So I'm not trying to convince the unconvinced that change is needed, but there's many people around the globe that are trying to create a better world. And so the question is, how can we support them? So a little exercise in imagination here. Can you imagine an architecture and platform that's comparable in power and sophisticated in reach to those enjoyed by Fortune 500 companies, but created by and for those on the forefront of our evolutionary transformation? Now, I'll tell you why I'm phrasing that question in a moment, but the question then what might that look like? You know, kind of what would its characteristics be? Is it even possible to build such a thing? Is there a path to meaningful adoption? And these are the questions that have been occupying my mind for the past 7 years. I'm going to really quickly mute everybody. So if you are, if you want to talk, you'll have to unmute yourself. And so here's one attempt at answering those questions. I make no claim to having the answer. It's obviously a huge problem, a ridiculously big problem that I'm tackling here. But I'll motivate how I ended up there by just going into my story a little bit. So I kind of feel like much of my life, I lived a fragmented existence. My professional career has been in software, a master's in computer science. I spent 30 years as a developer, architect, mostly for large companies. And in that environment, I had the opportunity to collaborate with some really creative people, really smart people, work on some really challenging problems. I spent a lot of that time as a developer, but then moved into various architecture roles. I had the opportunity to define a platform, a highly available distributed computing platform when I was at US West. And a pretty large effort. We had about 40 developers working on the platform, and we're using a lot of pretty big technologies, and it was used by several thousand developers on other projects that were happening at the time. So got some experience, what does it take to architect and deliver a platform? I've done data architecture, done a lot of what's called enterprise architecture, which is basically thinking about an entire collection of companies and the people and organization and business processes and technology that supports that collection of people and organizations, and thinking about how it could support them better. That's essentially what enterprise architecture is about. So that's what I sometimes refer to as my economic self. And at the same time that I was enjoying that professional career, I had, like I said, kind of a parallel self that I call my essential self. It began as a child. I was raised as a Christian Scientist, had a spontaneous healing experience, later sort of found the story of Christianity not so compelling, but led to inquiry that included a bachelor's undergraduate degree in philosophy, a lot of study of Eastern religions, as well as phenomenology and existentialism and Western analytical philosophy and so forth. Around 1975, I had what I think of as a spiritual epiphany, where I had a direct and immediately felt sense of being interconnected with everything. And during that several days, when I was kind of in that state, I found I could move my consciousness into different places. And for example, I was able to move it into stone, and had a sudden, just mind-blowing experience of what time looked like from the perspective of a stone. If you can, take our lifetime and the experiences we have, and then you put that into a rock's lifetime and compress a rock's lifetime, let's say, down to the same time span. Rocks experience a lot in their time. At any rate, many spiritual teachings, experiences, Tai Chi, various forms of meditation, and so forth. Lots of wonderful spiritual teachers. And at the same time, a serious and mounting concern about the direction civilization is headed. And this all, kind of tension between my essential self and my economic self. I pretty much compartmentalized the two. I didn't talk about the one I didn't talk about my essential self, didn't bring that to work, and I didn't bring my work into my spiritual community or into some of the other community I'm involved with. But that tension between those two mounted, and it culminated on January 8th, 2016, when I left Oracle. I'd been working at Sun Microsystems. It had been acquired by Oracle. I'd been at Oracle for several years. I left Oracle and sort of asked myself, what could I do to address the serious issues that the planet faced? And that's what I've been doing since. And so as I contemplate the many challenges, the meta crisis, as some refer to it, I don't think that technology is the answer. I don't think it's the most important. I don't think a platform is the most important part of the answer. Probably spiritual teachers or social architects like the pro-social community, or people that are actually hands in the dirt doing regenerative agriculture to regenerate our degraded environment. These are the critical practices and skills that we need going forward. But I feel like we all need to start with wherever we are, and we all have a role to play, and we all need to leverage our own gifts. So I happen to have the background to be able to architect robust platforms and think about large ecosystems and the technology that might better serve them. So that's how I got called to that. So I just wanted to make it clear that I'm not suggesting that technology is the answer, far from it, but that just seems to be where I have capacity to lend my hand. So a quick call to action. I think most people on this call are going to be very familiar with this. The issues we face are systemic in nature and global in scope. We're facing ecosystem collapse, economic dysfunction. And if we're going to avoid that collapse, we need really a profound shift in culture at global scale. We need to rethink, reimagine who we are and how we interact as people and as participants in the web of life. And yet all of this is happening at a time when our systems for collective sense-making, meaning-making, and choice-making are themselves breaking down. And then throw the asymmetric power powered by exponentially progressive technology and wielded by those that are most invested in the current culture, the interconnected engines of global commerce. And yeah, we've got a fine mess for ourselves. The good news is that when facing global crises, what looked at through an evolutionary lens, every quantum leap in evolution has been preceded by crisis and chaos and breakdown. And so while we're facing these crises, they're creating the conditions for change. So in many respects, it's like, what a time to be alive. We had this unprecedented opportunity to make a difference. As Hunter Levin said, we're the first generation to have dominion over the earth and likely the last to be able to save it. or as Lewis Herman says, today the very extremity of our global crisis creates an extraordinary opportunity for creative transformation. As Barbara Marx Hubbard said, we are part of a generation that for the first time in history is capable of destroying itself as a species or consciously participating in our own evolutionary transformation. So it's pretty amazing opportunity. And the breakdown is creating the conditions for change. And the good news is change is spontaneously emerging pretty much around the globe and in a whole bunch of sectors of human endeavor. At its heart is this fundamental recognition of a shift from the meme of separate, we're all separate from each other, separate from nature, in competition for scarce resources, to a re-embracing of our essential oneness that has been part of the indigenous worldview all along, but we're finally returning to that point of sanity. And so there's good shifts happening. Again, I'm not going to go through all of these, but I'm just seeing, when you look for it, you find that there's amazing thought leaders and communities that are bringing new ideas and doing this reimagining of how we interact with one another and with the web of life. And yet, it seems that collaboration and co-creation among these groups is limited. And that's unfortunate because, as I mentioned, this engine in commerce, the unconscious economy, if you will, that is driving the exploitation and exhaustion of resources and driving the degradation of our environment, they are heavily interconnected, they are global, and they are garnering heavy investment, whereas those that are on the forefront of evolutionary change are largely operating in silos with little in the way of shared infrastructure. I think people feel a deep yearning to discover and express their own unique role in order to aid the shift. But what's needed is a sense of agency at planetary scale, a sense that I can make a difference, and that by co-creating with others collectively, we can make a difference. So sort of this challenge question, design question, if you will, is how do we enable and empower coherent and cooperative collective action at all scales? Because I think it grows from the bottom up. So empower individuals, empower families, small social groups, up to commons, bioregions, planetary organisms. And what might an architecture for supporting that look like? And what arose in me as I contemplated that question, I've come to refer to as person-centric architecture. And I included this picture because these delightful beings are my 3 grandchildren. And they're outside in nature. So this picture serves as a reminder to me of why I'm doing this. So it is the case that there's more and more apps being put at people's fingertips. There's more apps being created all the time. And yet the way they're being delivered is via profoundly and progressively disempowering architecture. And let me take a few minutes just to go through sort of the predominant architecture. It starts with the observation that people are actually complex multidimensional beings. And we have both genetic and mimetic signatures. So genes, of course, everybody's familiar with. Memes, maybe less so. I'm not talking about the little popularized form of memes, definition of memes that you'll see on the internet with a cute picture and a clever phrase. I'm using Richard Dawkins' initial definition of meme, which is it's a self-replicating, mutating, and recombining unit of culture. So it could be ideas, symbols, practices, anything that can be conveyed, can be replicated, if you will, between people. And so my mimetic signature as a multidimensional being includes this complex web of beliefs, including the values that I hold, the aspirations that I have, my assumptions about the world and how it operates. How do we know things? What is fundamental reality? And really all the little bits of my knowledge in some sense are all parts of my memetic signature. So I'm both a genetic and memetic organism. And so the question is, how well do our current information systems support me as this complex individual person, and of course, and you? So I'm going to take Facebook as an example of people-centric architecture. And here I am at the bottom. And what do I have to do with the apps that I encounter with? Well, first thing I need to do is establish my identity within that app. And I need to do that because the app is storing information about me. So it's actually good that I have my identity there and that they authenticate me, because at least they're offering some protection of my data by forcing me to authenticate myself before they show data to me. The look and feel, sometimes referred to as the user interface, is determined by the app. So big companies will have large design systems to bring coherence to common look and feel across all their portfolio of applications. But that coherence is bounded by by that organization. And they're referred to as user interfaces, which right then and there reduces me to this sort of utilitarian role. It kind of puts me inside the app, and I have this subservient role. I'm a user of the app. And so instead of being this complex multidimensional being, I've been used to being a user. Had a good conversation with Doc Searles a couple of days ago in the Collabothon, and he reminded this fundamental principle from the Cluetrain Manifesto, and even more concisely from Edward Tufte. Only drug dealers and software companies call their customers users. Furthermore, each app pushes notifications to me based on its sense of what's important. It decides the format of the notification. It decides the timing of the notification. Sometimes I have a little bit of control over that on an app-by-app basis, but basically it's pushing stuff at me. Of course, I use more than one app. So that's kind of the picture of what it's like when I interact with one app. But what if we extend that to 8 apps? And so now we see that my data is fragmented. Bits of my data are fragmented around each of these, in this case, 8 apps. So I've got my social media posts in Facebook, and my financial information in Wells Fargo, and my health in UC Health, and so forth. I've got fragmented identity because each of these requires me to establish an identity. I've got a fragmented experience because each of them presents their own look and feel. And I've got fragmented notifications because they're each doing their own notifications. And so the burden of trying to bring coherence to even just to my experience, to try and recreate that so coherent sense of me, the burden of doing that lies with me. And the providers are actually working against me, especially those engaged in the attention economy business model, because they're basically using ever increasingly sophisticated techniques to try and capture my attention and hold me in their silo. I'm also significantly disempowered from a data perspective because these application providers are storing my data. They're sharing it outside of my control and outside my visibility. So I don't know who they share it with. I haven't seen who they have shared it with. So that's just with 8 apps, but I use more than 8. If you multiply that effect to tens or maybe even hundreds of apps, then you get this extremely fragmented experience, right? So the effect is that apps and their providers are in charge of all these bits of me. Is there an alternative? Can we imagine an alternative? Well, let's start with the complex multidimensional me. And what if we inverted the whole story? Instead of putting apps and the providers in the position of power and dominating the architecture. What if we made a person-centric architecture? What might that look like? So one thing you might want to do is say, well, let me determine what is urgent to me. So maybe there's a layer that intercepts the notifications that are coming from these disparate sources and puts me in control. I can decide how, where, and when, or if I want to receive those notifications. So they might send an email. Maybe it's something I'd prefer to see as a text, or they might send a text. Maybe I want it as an email, or maybe I don't want to get interrupted at all. Just put it in a notification center and let me go see what notifications have arrived in the past, unit of time from any source, right? So instead of being specific to each application, each with its own notification channel and notification center, if you will, what if I had a notification center and I could unify all the messages and have control? What if I had the power to shape my own, and I'll call it human experience, instead of reducing me to the role of a user, and instead of fragmenting my experience across the look and feel of the different apps? What if I was empowered to shape my own coherent experience of the collection of applications that I might engage with? And what if instead of me having to establish my identity within each application, what if you invert that model and apps need to establish their identity with me? And what if instead of the apps storing the data and me trusting that they're protecting it, what if I stored the data? And what if I had visibility and control over who sees my data? And ultimately, what if I just bring the apps to the data? So in the current model, right, the apps are storing the data, I'm remote from it, and I need to bring myself to the application. That's why we do SSO. That's why we do authentication, is because I need to prove my identity because I'm bringing myself to the application. But if I'm storing the data, what if we brought the applications to me? So by application, in this case, I mean like the program logic that's offering the behavior and the capabilities, but what if it was storing it in, on my devices? So now we see this architecture gives us what I call this expanded membrane of personal empowerment and a sense that I'm in charge. So I'm going to pause there because I've been talking straight through and I haven't had a chance to check the chat. Any comments or questions? I will open it up for more interactive after I get through sort of the material, but I did want to leave a few opportunities here for quick questions, mostly for questions of understanding. So far, so good. All right, we'll keep rolling then. So I'm going to segue to the mimetic activation platform, otherwise known as the MAP. And this is an open source, open-ended, decentralized computing and application services platform. And the goal of this platform is to foster the emergence of self-organizing evolutionary transformation at all scales. I want to emphasize that it's in a very early stage of proof of concept prototyping. So I'm going to be talking about it from the perspective, most of the slides are future oriented, what it will be like when it's built. But I wanted to put this caveat out there that it's not, it's not available to be used yet. In fact, this was my hesitation and even bring it to the Collabothon, as I didn't know if it was far enough along, but really what I'm doing in the Collabothon is trying to socialize this concept of person-centric architecture, irrespective of the map. And that kind of motivates the architecture for the map in fairly powerful ways, but I'm trying to socialize the person-centric architecture and begin to introduce what this platform might look like and welcome collaborators. So the map supports person-centric architecture. One of the components of the map is the map notification center that unifies notifications. As far as the human experience, the biggest component of that is something I call DAWN, which stands for the Dynamic Adaptive Holon Navigator. That's what generates the user experience. And it depends on map metaspaces and something called the Map Uniform API. In terms of the visibility of control and apps establishing their identity with me, that's accomplished via map concepts of map components called WeSpaces, map agreements, and the map security model. And storing the data, the map is built on top of Holochain. So all of the data storage right now is in Holochain. It's encapsulated. The architecture is layered. So I could swap in a different storage technology if it made sense. I have been in conversation with Nico Luck from the Atom project, if you're familiar with that offers storage in an environment where you could choose the backend as IPFS or basically alternate data stores. So it is encapsulated, the storage within the architecture. But for the prototype and for the foreseeable future, I'm excited actually to be taking advantage of the Holochain capabilities. And most people know that Holochain recently just went to beta, so that's a good milestone for them. So building on top of Holochain are things I call Holon spaces, metaspaces, iSpaces, and WeSpaces. So each of these will start making more sense as I sort of go through this. So what could you do with the map? Well, the map invites yourself to put yourself on the map. It invites you to store your data in your personal iSpace on your devices. And that can be done securely and resiliently. It allows you to bring apps into the membrane of your iSpace. So earlier I talked about, instead of bringing myself to the app that hostages my data, this allows me to bring apps into the membrane of my iSpace. It invites you to shape your own experience of the apps you use. There's a commons called vSpaces that designers and developers can contribute visualizers into. And then the human experience is dynamically and adaptively generated by DAWN. It's continuously evolving under your control. And in fact, your personalizations not only influence your experience, but they serve as sort of votes that influence the collective experience. So the default experience of new users of the map will be generated based on the collective personalizations that prior map explorers have applied. So effectively, we're crowdsourcing the human experience. It allows you to take charge of how, what, and when you receive notifications. It allows you to express your thoughts and artistic expressions. You can do so privately in your own iSpace, or you can offer them to others. You can share them in crowdsourced commons. Examples being in meme spaces, you can put your memes in the meme space, or you can put your videos or books or what have you, which are resources. You can put those into WeSpaces as well. I said commons there. It's not actually restricted to commons. It's also possible to create markets. And we'll talk about that as we go. The map invites you to interact with friends and families and colleagues, intentional communities, commons, markets, and much more into self-organizing WeSpaces. These feature pluggable culture, pluggable governance models, pluggable protocols. As things evolve, there's always new protocols being introduced. When I started in the 90s, I don't even remember what the protocols were, but eventually we moved to DCE and Corba, and then more recently it was SOAP. And so if you were interacting using WSDL, you would describe your interface using WSDL, and then it became, more recently REST, and now some people are excited about GraphQL. So these protocols are constantly changing. So if the platform were tied to a particular protocol, that would limit its utility. But mostly because it's bottom-up, self-organizing spaces, there's a lot of evolutionary experimentation happening. There's a lot of governance models, holacracy, sociocracy, pro-social design principles. There's many different ideas about how to do choice making and sense making and meaning making. And so the idea, each of those could be put into this, what I call the global meme pool. And if you're starting a group, you can decide as a group which governance model you find in the meme pool, for example, you want to adopt as an agreement by which this group will make decisions, for example. Each space has its own mimetic signatures. And so if you're a purpose-oriented group, the vision and values and principles that align you, your shared aspirations, are part of your space mimetic signature. I mentioned the governance model, the protocols we'll agree upon for interaction within this space. And apps can be added to groups instead of groups added to apps. So if you think about it, right, there's Facebook groups, there's Google groups, there's Discord servers, there's, I don't know what Mattermost calls them, but pretty much every social media platform out there. Hilo has a notion of groups, right? They all have groups, but those groups are all subordinate to the apps. Again, that's the app-centric architecture. If you invert that model, groups become primary, right? So then you can talk about groups in apps. Define your group once, and then you can decide what apps are we as a group going to share, right? But you don't have to establish your group again and again and again in each app. Ultimately, the goal is that allows you to align your economic self with your essential self. When I had that moment in January 2016, when I left Oracle and I kind of decompressed for a month, that's when it became apparent to me how much tension I was holding in those two parallel compartmentalized parts of myself. And when I allowed those to come together, I experienced this, what I described as a deep exhale, a deep sense of integration, deep sense of interconnection that I hadn't even realized had been missing. And I really wanted others to experience that. So that was when one of the big motivations was, for people that are following their heart and doing heartfelt work, maybe volunteering for a nonprofit or doing what they can, maybe doing open source software development, because that's what their heart is calling them to do. But then to put food on the table and shelter overhead and take care of our families and so forth, then our economic self, engages in that unconscious economy, which is destroying the earth and life on it. So the whole goal of the map is to allow you to get your livelihood, if you will, to align the work that your heart is calling you to do with the work that puts food on the table and shelter overhead. And it does so by allowing you to offer mimetically signed services. So services that also have mimetic signatures. You can offer services into these spaces under a wide variety of different value flows. So it could be a gift economy, you could be offering it for reputational enhancement, it could be cryptocurrency based, it could be fiat currency based. It's totally up to you how you want to define the value flows. And then you can find and accept service offers that are offered by other agents. And since there's also an aspirational aspect to each service definition, part of its mimetic signature can say, these are the values that this service is aligned to. So like it aligns with fair trade or organic, or maybe the ratio of the highest to the lowest paid person in the entire supply chain behind the resources delivered through this service. Maybe it's no more than 20-1. These are examples of sort of aspirational characteristics of a service offer. And so when you're searching for services offered by others, you can do that on the basis of both their sort of horizontal functional capabilities. I'm looking for a book, this book. And it will say, we're offering this book and it'll cost you $5. But then the aspirational or vertical dimension of that service signature can tell you other aspects about its supply chain, its sourcing, it comes from renewable materials and so forth. So it allows you to both offer and find and accept service offers. And ultimately, the vision here is to participate in missions, in larger goals, in larger enterprises, in which organizations play a part, instead of the more conventional view, which is organizations have their mission, usually oriented around maximizing value for their shareholders or realizing their goals. So this, again, inverts that model. Instead of organizations with missions, missions with organizations. And that turn of phrase, I owe a debt of gratitude to Michael Beckwith. He actually came up with the phrase, we need missions with businesses instead of businesses with mission. The map also invites you to scaffold trust. So trust is a very fragile thing. It really depends upon human relationships. And there's a limit to how many human relationships I can keep track of. But if I can establish a community with people I really know and establish trust there, then we can establish that as a higher level agent, if you will, that can interact with other communities, and you can establish trust between communities. And eventually you can scaffold that trust to higher scales. So that's really what it's sort of there for and what it's about. Ultimately, to foster co-creation of a world that works for all. That might be sort of that ultimate mission. And so if you imagine that as sort of an aspirational value or goal, then all the organizations that are aligned to co-creating a world that works for all are in some sense part of that larger enterprise, part of that larger mimetic organism, part of that larger we space at a global level. So that's kind of the motivation for it. I'm going to see if there's any quick questions.
Yeah, just one quick thing that how you connect the individual to the community. So you really need to empower the individual.
Yes.
To form their own network.
Yes.
To feed into this.
Indeed.
That's missing. That's big.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
And that's why
beautiful.
These we spaces are self-organizing we spaces, right? Organized, evolved from the bottom up.
No, what I mean, supporting interpersonal communication.
Yep. Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
And in fact, I'll show examples of that as we go. So I'm going to start with some sort of the foundations. In the interest of time, I'm going to go through these relatively quickly. But the first design principle is that technology serves life, not the other way around. The primacy of the individual, it kind of follows from person-centric. The sovereignty, my identity, my data, but also transparency. So collaboration and cooperation and co-creation depend upon transparent sharing. So there's this interesting sort of tension between my control over my data and sort of holding it tightly, contrast with transparency. In order to co-create with others, I need to be vulnerable with them, right? And so in that interpersonal interaction that you were just talking about, Giri, each individual is free to sort of find that balance between how much they're willing to share transparently. And again, that's rooted in trust, and that's rooted in the communities that they are finding themselves in. Another big principle is pull rather than push. So instead of search engines pushing ads at me, applications pushing notifications at me, big pushes from the different application tech giants, this is a pull model. I'll pull things into my space that I want. And I choose the timing and I choose what it is that I want. I don't have to reveal my identity to pull stuff in. So it inverts the surveillance model. It is self-organizing, crowdsourced, open-ended, and bottoms up. At its foundational layer, and I'll get into this in a little more detail, it's got a holonic structure. Everything is active, self-describing holons and holon relationships. And I'll explain what that means in a moment. It's also omnicentric, and I'm going to defer explaining that until I show you an example. It's open source, so no one owns the map, and it actively resists enclosure, and it's also open-ended. So the governance models, the values, the principles, these are all examples of memes that are crowdsourced. So anybody can put their own ideas into the meme pool. So the meme pool is crowdsourced. And so it's constantly being evolved. And Marc Antoine has some doing really interesting work on how you can manage that evolution in a way that allows you to bring some coherent agreement around meaning, but still support a very participative kind of meme generation dynamic. It supports pluggable ontologies managed as commons. So the map doesn't dictate a particular ontology other than at a very meta level that I'll talk about. We've already talked about pluggable governance, pluggable culture, pluggable visualizers in Dawn, pluggable protocols. This is a quick look at it's a high level look, which means I'm eliding some details, but it gives you at least some visual to imagine, you know, the human at the top. They interact with Dawn, which is the dynamic adaptive holon navigator that actually runs in their browser. And then the holochain conductor, also running on the same machine as their browser, typically, is where sort of the rest of these components live. Dawn communicates to the other map components through this uniform API. And that was inspired by the evolution of APIs. You know, again, going back to Java remote method invocation, DCE, Corba, so REST, so forth. Especially RESTful architectures kind of pioneered this, really bringing the power of uniform APIs. So I've looked at things like JSON schema and Swagger and OpenAPI as standards to inform the holonic API, to create this sort of uniform API that renders everything in terms of holons, holon relationships. Holons have properties, holons offer actions. And so that's what Dawn leverages to be able to generate the user experience. The different spaces within the map are actually each their own holochain applications. So V spaces is where visualizer are managed. Those are dynamically loaded by Dawn when it wants to generate the UI. Meta spaces are where the type descriptions are stored. So remember I said that everything is self-describing active holons. Well, those descriptions, what are the properties that a holon type offers? What are the holon types? What actions do they offer? What relationships do they participate in? That's all stored in metaspaces. Meme spaces are the things that store meme pools. Agent spaces, of which we have both iSpace and WeSpace, are two different views of an agent space. Those are each apps. And then resources are managed in resource spaces. Those are the application logic, and then the data is stored on my devices. And again, that's using the holochain, leveraging the holochain capabilities to do that. To connect to the external world, because of course, not everything is going to run on this platform, at least not for a while. No, never. There's these adapters. And basically, if you can describe the interface to your application, so if you have a RESTful interface or GraphQL or SOAP, if you can describe it, then you put its descriptor, the description of that interface into the metaspace, and then that allows an adapter to make calls on your application or receive calls back from your application and feed it into the holonic API, where then it becomes available both for visualization using Dawn, so we can visualize the data from other applications in Dawn, without them having to have developed their application with that in mind. And we can also store data from those applications in on my devices. So quick look at the ontologies. Map is built on a layered ontology. So the most foundational layer, layer 0, is literally just self-describing active holons and visualizers. So every map object is either a holon or a holon relationship. And holons are self-describing. Holons are active. That means holons can do things. That means there's a set of actions. So when you describe a holon, you say, these are the actions it can perform. These are the properties that it has. These are the relationships it participates in. And then holon visualizers are tied to these holon types and property types and action types. And they provide a rich palette for perceiving and interacting with holon graphs. So that's the most foundational layer, part of what's called map core. Layer 1 is built on top of layer 0. And layer 1 introduces the 4 primary abstractions of the map, which are memes, resources, agents, and services. And then layers 2 and above are the extensibility layers. That's where any of the objects in layer 1 and 0 and 1 can be extended. So diving a little bit deeper into these self-describing active holons, you've got holon types, and then relationship types have a from and to side. Holon types have 0 or more properties, and those are defined in property types, and they offer a set of actions. So you may notice that this is supporting binary relationships. If you want n-array relationships, you can create a relationship holon type, a new holon type, that has multiple relationships associated to it. So you can create n-array relationships out of this, but at its definitional layer, supports binary relationships. And so at the bottom, instances, an instance of a holon type is a holon instance. An instance of a holon relationship type is a holon relationship, and an instance of a property type is a property value. And when you actually perform an action, the result of that is an event. So an instance of an action is an event. Visualizers. Right now, I've identified basically 5 types of visualizers. It seems to cover a really broad cross-section of experiences, including, and at the top level visualizer is a canvas visualizer. This is sort of the overall container. This is where themes, styles, color, font, and so forth can be defined. Basically, you could put a whole design system associated with a canvas that governs a lot of aspects and brings a lot of uniformity to look and feel. Then a canvas can contain one or more of the other types of visualizers. Collections are there to view collections of objects. Graph allow you to see graphs of objects. Nodes allow you to look at a single holon and its properties and relationships. And property visualizers are building blocks that allow you to display individual properties. Each visualizer type has an affinity to some type descriptor. So if you have, for example, had a book holon type, there could be a book visualizer, a book node visualizer. Maybe there's 20 book node visualizers because different developers had different ideas about nice ways of rendering book information. And so that affinity is really a relationship between the type and one of the types down below. But if you're talking about visualizing a date, then it would have an affinity to for a date property type. But that relationship, that's a many-to-many relationship actually, is used part of the dynamic selection of visualizers when it's generating the user interface, the human interface, relies on those affinities. And then finally, the visualizer usages when there's actually, when you decide which of those 20 book visualizer you really like, then that records a usage of that visualizer. And that's where you can put your personalized configuration of that visualizer. So I'm glossing over there. Dawn is a huge component, and it's the most novel and probably the one I spent the most time on. So there's lots of documentation about it. So it's a bit of a challenge to try and distill it down to what I hope is a somewhat digestible form, but at its highest level, that's kind of what it looks like. And I mentioned the uniform API. The uniform API really is expressed in terms of these type descriptors, right? So if you're familiar with like JSON schema or OpenAPI, OpenAPI allows you to describe an interface. These are the operations offered by this interface. This is the information required and produced by the interface and so forth. And so the map does that with, by leveraging these descriptors. And it does it in the descriptors are basically provide an abstract syntax. So the concrete syntax, as I mentioned, could evolve, right? So we went from DCE descriptions to various interface definition language. Corba had theirs, WSDL for SOAP, JSON schema for REST, and so forth. Those are all concrete syntaxes. This tries to abstract what's the information content that's similar across those different interface definition styles and capture that information. And then we can generate concrete syntax. And that's how we can support pluggable protocols. Because, if you want a JSON schema, for example, representation, because you're talking with something that uses a REST interface and assumes JSON as the interchange format, then you could generate that concrete syntax from these abstract type descriptors. So that's at the heart of what's in the sort of the uniform API. So these things are managed in different spaces, different I spaces, and I'll talk more about I spaces in a moment, but visualizers are managed in V spaces, which could be commons or could be a market. Type descriptors are managed in meta spaces, and instances of those things are managed within a variety of I spaces. There isn't one I space for that. It's like it's my data, so wherever my data is being stored. It could be stored as hold-on relationships, needn't be. So you could have a different storage representation. Doesn't have to be stored as hold-ons. It could be stored in a more native format. As long as you can describe what that format is and translate it into instances that look like this, then it can be trafficked through the uniform API. This is a quick look at what layer 1 looks like. The 4 major components, and the important thing is they all have relationships between each other. So for example, agents offer services. Services have memetic signatures, so there's a service to meme relationships. Memes are hold-ons, so they can be that is, they can participate in meme holarchy. So you can group memes together and say, well, this is a memeplex. Just like we have geneplexes, which are genes that are found to replicate better together than they do individually. Memeplex is the same thing. So like sociocracy is a memeplex. As an example, Constitution is a memeplex. Those would be examples of meme to meme relationships. Agents can exhibit memes as part of their memetic signature, or they can inhibit memes. So racism is a meme. An agent could have no relationship to that meme, which indicates that that agent is not taking a position, if you will, or it could inhibit that meme, saying it's actively inhibiting racism, or it could exhibit that meme, meaning it's actively exhibiting racism. Agents have relationships with one another and so forth. I think I've given you enough of a feel for what's going on there. So let's move into agent spaces and interactions now that we've laid some of the foundation.
Not sure what you mean. Sorry, not sure what you meant by resources here. Is it physical resources or data resources? I was
Thank you for, because yeah, I don't really have a slide on that. So thanks for bringing that up, Marc-Antoine. Yeah, it's a very general notion of resources. And in fact, it's the least favorite name because it implies a sort of utility to it. But yeah, resources could be financial resources, could be physical resources, could be information resources, resources expressed in any of a number of currencies. Pretty much adopt the meta currencies. If you're familiar with that project, I adopt their definition of resource. So anything that is a resource there is a resource here.
Is anything subject to a flux, I guess.
Yeah, and resources basically are what flows between services.
Makes sense. It's just we often use the word resource to mean data resources.
Yeah,
just different.
Yeah, no, thank you for that question, because I had meant to clarify that and I hadn't, so thank you. So if you think about that person-centric architecture diagram of using, it kind of focused on the individual, but really we need to extend this person-centric architecture to support self-organizing groups of agents, right, at ever greater scale. So how does that work? So I'm going to get into a little bit more formal definition of how agents work. So an agent in the map, the definition is any entity with the capacity to sense and respond to its environment. So a very general notion of agent. It has both subjective and objective aspects. If you're into Ken Wilber and integral theory, I did a mapping here. In the interest of time, I'm probably going to skip through this. But I will mention that an agent could be a cell in the body, though I don't expect the map to explicitly represent cells. But certainly person, a holochain node, a bot, a software agent, a family is an agent, communities, organizations, commons, enterprises, even economies can be thought of as agents. I was inspired, the design of the map was inspired by this wonderful book, Relationships That Heal, Diane Tegetmeier. I had the privilege of meeting her and she kindly sent me a book, and I was a game changer for me. She was a molecular biologist who became a psychotherapist, and she abstracted principles she learned as a molecular biologist and applied them to human relationships. And so these 6 principles that I'm about to share here, came from that book. So the first is containment. So agents are encapsulated in a membrane. And what that means is there's an inside and an outside. You can talk about things inside the membrane and you can talk about things outside the membrane. These membranes are selectively permeable. So that means resources can flow in both directions, but selectively. The membrane selectively admits and emits different resources. Agents exist in interspaces. These are spaces in which they find themselves, and they provide the medium through which they can carry messages. The interspace carries messages from one agent to another. With evolution, there is differentiation. So agents can specialize. They can offer different kinds of services. If you go back to the definition of agent, sense, and respond, well, the processes and internal instructions by which an agent senses, these are the inputs, and responds, these are the outputs to their environment. So I'm showing that here with this little box that says service implementation. So I took the liberty of sort of translating it into software terms, but basically the implementation of a service determines when I sense this, I respond in that way. And finally, there's interdependence. Each agent takes care of its own needs, but they are in interdependent relationship with agents both within them and outside. So you can have sub-agents. So that was the sort of the inspiration, and that led to the map concept of an agent. It has a containing membrane. It has a memetic signature. Agents offer services that support the flow and transformation of resources to and from other agents for mutual benefit. And you'll notice the service offering also has a memetic signature. That little green and red circle with the purple pi in it is my icon for a memetic signature. And it illustrates that the signature can both inhibit some memes and exhibit other memes. And a subset of your memes are your values memes. Service offerings can have service implementations inside the membrane. Resources, and I guess I did have this definition here, include money, reputation, food, water, tangible goods. Again, some resources are depleted with use and others aren't. It certainly also includes, should have listed information and data in here as well. Those are also resources. And assets are resources that are temporarily stewarded by an agent. Again, resources flow between agents. So while the resources are, if you will, within the membrane of an agent, they're considered assets of that agent. So the agent's iSpace manages the space inside the membrane. So that includes storage of all private keys. So your wallet would be inside your iSpace. Your personas, which are the way you expose your identity to others. You can have multiple personas. Those personas are actually stored in your iSpace. Application logic, you bring apps into your iSpace and they execute in your app space, in your iSpace. The iSpace also identifies subagents. So if I'm a person, my laptop, my desktop, my phone, these might all be examples of subagents that are part of my iSpace. The iSpace provides private storage, asset management, and iSpace is where notifications happen. So those are the primary responsibilities of the iSpace. WeSpaces manage the interactions between iSpaces. And an iSpace can participate in multiple WeSpaces. So we'll show an example here of a WeSpace. In this case, I'm kind of showing how interactions work. So we got two agents here. The one on the left is providing a service. And for this example, let's say that's a healthcare provider and the service requesting agent on the right-hand side is me, right? So I've got two different iSpaces. And we have come together in a WeSpace. And I'll talk a little bit later about how that happened. But in that WeSpace, there is an agreement. So before the agreement, the service providing agent offered a service. Let's say it's a healthcare diagnostic service. And I chose to accept that offer. And it is actually in the acceptance of that offer that an agreement is formed. And in this case, that's what caused this WeSpace to come into existence. It's a dedicated WeSpace consisting only of the service providing agent and the healthcare provider and me. So we are the only agents in this WeSpace. Might have to add an insurance agent, some other agents, third party, fourth party payers, but to keep it simple, I'm just going to keep it at two agents. And this agreement basically governs the interactions. So now that we have the agreement in place, there can be a service invocation. So let's say I requested a service, a diagnostic service, and part of the agreement said, I'm willing to share a portion of my health record. In fact, I'll share my whole personal health record. Don't want to share any of my financial data or my social media posts or my other data, but I will grant permission for the service provider to access my entire personal health record in order to deliver the diagnosis. So that, if I back that up again, if you notice R1 is sitting down as an asset inside my iSpace. In order to get it over to the healthcare provider, I need to move it to the membrane where the WeSpace can take over. And based on the protocol that's defined by the agreement, it can convey that personal health record to the service providing agent, to their WeSpace, their side of the WeSpace. In order to bring their diagnostic tools to bear, they need to bring it inside of their membrane. So now it is in their iSpace, and they can, basically use that to come up with a diagnosis. Now, do they store that data? I'll show that again. Do they store that data? Well, the agreement would say that, right? So one of the projects I did, in fact, a project I did when I was in Oracle, I led their HIPAA compliance effort. So they had $20 million, they said, of revenue every month they had to leave on the table because they couldn't enter into HIPAA compliance agreements because they couldn't manage, couldn't guarantee they could manage personal health information in a way that would be compliant with HIPAA. You don't think of Oracle probably as a healthcare company, but many of their customers are. So the Oracle support organization, when their customer had a support issue, they would say, send us your database dump or send us your log files. And those database dumps or log files could have PHI in them, personal health information. And so what happened is their support organization, the engineers in their support organization had each developed their own sort of favorite tools for diagnosing, for parsing log files and examining database dumps, and they would use their tools to help diagnose the customer problem. Well, in order to do that, they would copy the customer data that had been uploaded to their tool. So this is a classic example of bringing the data to the tool. And in fact, that whole mantra of bring the tool to the data grew out of that project. It took us 3 years, but we did succeed in getting Oracle HIPAA compliant. And the way we did it was to manage the data centrally and bring tools to the data. It turns out that HIPAA compliance creates liability for companies, right? So does the healthcare provider really need to persist my personal health record? Do they really need a copy of it? Or if they had access to it whenever they needed it, right? If I could, through an agreement, a cryptographically signed agreement that's immutable, non-forgeable, and non-repudiable, then that basically says that gives them the affordance of getting my data whenever they need it. So they don't actually have to take persistent custody of the data in order to deliver the service. And so that means that they're actually relieved of HIPAA reliability by not taking custody. At any rate, the agreement would spell out what the data sharing and information access parts of that agreement are. Marc-Antoine, did you have a question?
Yeah, two things. I wonder if it's possible to, whenever you send data over, it can be copied. I wonder if it's possible to enforce non-copying at the holochain level, contract level. So I know holochain only up to a certain point. I'm not sure about that. But I'm more curious about the other way. You're speaking about sending the data and not storing it. Couldn't you send the diagnostic code and not copy it? And
yeah, that's what's
really
happening.
really bring the code to the data.
Yeah. So in this case, let's follow this. So excellent question. I'll actually answer it a little bit later. The short answer is there is no way to prevent data from being copied. Ultimately, there's lots of controls that are offered here, but at the end of the day, let's say it needs to be decrypted so they can look at it to form their diagnosis. Well, there's no way to keep them from snapping a screenshot or getting their iPhone out and taking pictures of it, right, and sending it to their friends, right? And so in the notion of agreements, you'll see I have a 3D architecture for agreements that was inspired by the architecture behind Creative Commons licenses. So, and I guess since I've gone this far, I'll just mention briefly, there's 3 levels of that agreement. There's the human readable part of the agreement, so people understand what that agreement is about. There's the software readable part, which is amenable to software execution. And that's what the WeSpace software can use to enforce these data sharing agreements. There's also a legal representation in the agreement that can say, bring in, the whole legal jurisdictional process to say, you are liable if you share this information with others outside the system. We can still we have legal recourse.
Thank you.
Yeah. So let's follow this. We sent the health record to the doctor so they can make the diagnosis. R7 is their diagnosis. That comes back through their membrane across the WeSpace to my half of the WeSpace and into my personal health record. So I can be the repository. Same thing happens when I go to the lab. Any other doctor, my pharmacist, my health devices, I can truly be the repository of my entire personal health record, rather than having it fragmented across all of the different healthcare providers that I deal with. So that's basically at a high level how the interaction model works. I've talked about agent spaces. It's bounded by a membrane. It consists of a collection of agents as well as the medium through which they interact. And there's two views of it. So the I space view is the view of an agent space from the perspective of the containing agent. So this is sort of looking inside the membrane. And the we space view of an agent space is looking at the collection of agents within that we space and how they interact with each other. So we space is about the interactions between them, and I space is internal. It follows directly from the definition of a holon, which is at the same time a part in a whole. So I'm part of a larger whole, and I also contain smaller parts inside of my whole. So that helps. So an I space encapsulates my data on my devices, which are basically at a personal level, those are my sub-agents, my laptop, my desktop, my holoports. And then I can bring the apps or the program logic into my I space from sort of app stores, which could be a market or a commons, right? So these different apps, I'm bringing the apps to the data here. No SSO, no OAuth required. We space is focused on the interaction between agents. So you can kind of see I only have one I space, but I can participate in multiple we spaces. And so agents can be fractally composed into holarchies. So a computing node is an agent. In fact, that is the holochain definition of agent, is computing node. So the map extends the holochain's agent-centric architecture. And so I've introduced person as a first-class object. Well, you can see in this case, the person agent maybe has 3 computing nodes, my laptop, my desktop, my bullet port, and so forth, inside my I space now. I can be part of an organization can be part of an enterprise. And so you kind of move from I space, which is again the internal, we space is where the interactions happen. So this is how you can fractally compose agents into holarchies. So in a traditional sort of top-down power dissemination hierarchy, I'm going to be at the bottom, right? The powerful lord or king or CEO, whatever's going to be at the top, and I'm going to be down here with the peons. But in the map, instead of being at the bottom of a hierarchy, I'm actually at the center of a set of holarchies. Again, person-centric. So in the map, I am the center of my universe. And so are you. And in fact, every holon is the center of its own universe. And so the human experience of the map is omniperspectival. It's a mouthful, but really what it means is, if I'm looking at me as a holon, I'm going to see my assets, my data, my relationships. Maybe one of those is my mimetic signature of some sociocracy, let's say governance model that I participate in. If I jump to sociocracy meme, that becomes the center of my experience. And now I can see who are the stewards of sociocracy, who are the consultants that offer services that can help me implement sociocracy, who are the agents that are currently exhibiting sociocracy as part of their mimetic signature, and what experience are they having with them? Maybe I want to reach out to them, right? So each time you sort of navigate to a new holon, then you can look at the world, if you will, through all the relationships that holon participates out. So that's what I mean by omnicentric. We spaces have different sizes, right? Just as cells discovered they can only grow to a certain size and they couldn't really grow any larger. So to amplify their agency, then we got multicellular organisms, right? You can bind together in multiple cells. So it's a similar concept here with holarchies. Within a community, trust is a very fragile thing, right? And it depends on human relationships and human familiarity, right? So I'm going to trust, my level of trust is higher with the people I know, but I can only know so many people. So this is that concept of smaller communities are more trustworthy. As I get to larger and larger communities or further networked communities, they're greater reach. There's more people there if I'm trying to get a message out, but with less trust. And so hold that thought in mind. I want to quickly just kind of highlight this agent model can be used to represent communities, organizations, families, governments, enterprises. Same model. So the global meme pool allows agents to search for and select standard governance models or agreement types, share vocabularies for information access agreements, visualizers, and so forth. So as an example, here's a bunch of decision-making memeplexes. Well, I could search the global meme pool for these, for decision-making models, and then explore those again, see who's defining them, what is the definition, who's using them, who's offering consulting services, and so forth. Commons is an iSpace. And I've pulled in the definition from David Bolyer's book, Think Like a Commoner, that sort of defined 4 different dimensions of what a commons is. But it's a system for the long-term stewardship of resources that preserve shared values and community identity. So here we have a mimetic signature that can capture the shared values. The agents within this iSpace are the community. The resources that are managed by this commons are the assets that are inside the membrane of the commons, and so forth. So commons is an iSpace. I love this quote from Tagore on services. Going back to the 4 major components of the L1 ontology. We've talked about agents. We've said all I'm going to say about memes and resources, but I will talk about services, which is the 4th dimension here. So quick example of a physical service. We've got this Cajun food truck as a service providing agent, and it's going to offer, in this case, it's using a sandwich board. It's going to place an offer for its service. And that offer can include both a vertical promise and a horizontal promise. The horizontal promise is kind of the transactional value, right? We'll give you a large muffaletta sandwich in exchange for $5. The vertical promise talks about more the aspirational aspects. So all the ingredients are organic, farm to table certified. The Cajun food truck is a B Corp. So those are examples of its vertical process. The implementation of that service, that's what happens inside the truck. In fact, the truck itself is part of the implementation. So you don't see that, that's inside the membrane of the Cajun food truck agent. So here comes Rosa, a service requesting agent. She says, I'll have the large muffaletta, please. That's the agreement. So the horizontal flow, there's the $5, there's the muffaletta sandwich. And through the course of that, there were several events generated, right? There was the order event, there was the acceptance of the order, there was the delivery of the food, and the payment received. So those would all be examples of events. So agents and agent hierarchies we've looked at. Service offerings are discoverable via pluggable promises. You can decide what your offer is in both horizontal and vertical dimensions. Agreements, which are a generalization of smart contracts, which are partially automatically enforceable. Mark Antoine asked a question about, is it always fully enforceable? And the answer is no. And that's why sometimes we need to rely on other things like just human reputation, pure consequences, or legal recourse. Resources flow via service invocations, and they create auditable, immutable, non-repudiable, and non-forgeable event logs via holochain DHTs. We've already been through this model. offers are placed in we spaces. And I mentioned they have mimetic signatures. And so these are components of the signature. You can have general information about the service, its name, its version, its ID. You can indicate what protocols you support, the beckon protocol, the J-link protocol, the, HTTP, of course, REST, what have you. Could be human protocols if these are human-to-human services. You share public keys. So the offerer's signature verification key and their encryption key are part of the offer. The information access agreement, that's where it specifies what information is required in order to deliver this service and what information is produced as a result. And that information is references definitions that are stored in metaspaces. This defines the conditions for sharing with the other agents. This is where you would say, you can have it, but you can't persist it. You can't share with anybody else, for example. The offer can clarify the lifecycle flows and the aspirational signature, the exhibited memes and the inhibited memes. Yeah, and I mentioned I followed the Creative Commons license architecture. There's 3 levels: machine readable, human readable, and legal. All 3 of those representations are put into a single bundle, which is then digitally signed. So that whole offer becomes immutable, non-repudiable. You can't say you didn't offer it, and it's non-forgeable. You can't say you weren't the one that offered it because you've signed it with your private signing key. And anybody can verify that because the signature verification key is part of the public keys that's included in the offer. So remember we talked about reach and trust. If you're offering something, you probably want high reach, right? You want maybe a large number of people to be familiar with the offer. So if I'm a healthcare provider, I could put my offer into a very large WeSpace. But once we've concluded an agreement, then it ain't nobody business, but it's just between me and the healthcare provider what happens there, right? So this creates a dedicated WeSpace, and any information like the logs of this fact that there's an agreement and the event logs are stored within the membrane of this dedicated WeSpace. So accepted offers can result in dedicated WeSpaces, what are high trust. Almost done. Who's the map for? Well, ultimately, we're all in this together. Kind of the whole point is we need to recognize the fundamentally interdependent, interconnected, interrelated nature of reality and the fact that all living things are in relationship to one another. So in some sense, the map is for everyone. But more pragmatically, it's for thought leaders who can steward memes into the meme pools, media producers who create films and books, images that can be evocative of those memes, evolutionary storytellers, people that are disillusioned and looking for some empowerment, maybe have been awakened to root cause and are ready to act, social entrepreneurs, investors can invest in memes and services. Meme certifiers can help if somebody represents that they are exhibiting a meme certifier could offer evidence of that. You can also use reputation models, things like the neighborhoods application, that's another one of the holochain applications, would be a good example of that. And enterprise co-creators. Finally, just a quick look at Dawn. The central design question for Dawn was, how can you create a human experience of the map if you don't know what data and capabilities it's going to be providing a human experience for, right? So the traditional approach to developing what would be called user interfaces, you know what the data is that you're presenting, you know what the actions the user is supposed to be able to do, right? But in this person-centric architecture, you don't know what apps they're going to bring into their iSpace, right? You don't know what data to present or what actions. So the answer So far, and again, this is proof of concept, so we'll be proving it as part of the prototype, is to basically look at all of the design decisions that designers make at design time and creatively try and think how you could defer that design decision to runtime so that you can dynamically generate the HX. You can allow human experience developers to place visualizers in common. So those are like your building blocks. You can leverage the fact that everything is self-describing. That's the key piece here, right? If I know that this book has a title and an author, I can see what properties it has. Okay, well, if I have like a form, then I can, and I know what properties, I can just put those properties in the form as long as I know how to visualize each of the properties. But they have I know what type they are, and they can have a string visualizer or a date visualizer or what have you, right? So you leverage those descriptions, you offer radical personalization capabilities, and then you use the personalization gestures to adaptively evolve default experience. So what does that mean? Well, this is the design concept. You've got this holonic structure. Remember, we can turn everything into holons as shown on the left. You've got the visualizers, sorry, the holonic structure, the data on the right, and the visualizers on the left. They both feed into a selector function that dynamically selects visualizers based on the type of data to be presented. The human interface generator then generates the experience. Human interface developers can contribute visualizers to the V-spaces on the left, and thought leaders and map developers can contribute data and memes, the thing on the right. Stuff on the left is in green there, that's the functionality delivered by the Dawn HAP, and the Metaspace HAP manages the stuff on the left. As an example of the adaptive nature of it, some of you may be familiar with this exploit versus explore mode of being, right? If I'm doing a task again and again and again, I don't want the human experience changing, right? I know I've got the layout, it's optimized just for how I want to see it. So I want it to be more predictable. On the other hand, if I'm exploring and I'm feeling more open-ended, I'm willing to entertain. In fact, I want more novelty. So there's these different sliders that people could use to influence how the interface is dynamically generated. The personal to collective, for example. If I've done a personalization, if I've figured out how I want it to look, if I want it to be predictable, I can just pin that and say, anytime you see data of this type, I always want to see it in this form. But that would deprive me the opportunity of seeing, hey, maybe some new visualizer has been put into vSpace that I want to take advantage of. Or maybe people have found a wonderful visualizer. It's really gaining traction. So I can weight my personal versus collective, like move that slider around. On the collective side, I can look at, what's trending all-time popularity, or what's trending recently, what's hot. I may want to only use mature visualizers. But if I'm feeling more adventurous, maybe I want to find out what's available in beta or alpha. And then finally, I can inject some degree of randomness in all of that. So those are an example of the kinds of controls that Dawn would offer. Really quickly, I mentioned it's a prototype. We're in that stage, so I wanted to show you concretely where we're at. These are the 5 use cases that we are implementing. The ability to select, it's basically around the metaspace. So allow you to select and view holon types, create and edit holon types, view and update holons of that type. This is the prototype architecture that we're using. And post-prototype, we might be able to put in some adapters. So there's things like if people are using murmurations, we could probably pretty quickly import the JSON schema that is the murmurations representation into Metaspace, and then be able to create an adapter that would allow us to get data to and from your application, and then start to present your user interface. We keep your native user interface that you want, but it would we could also start playing around with visualizers and show how we could dynamically generate them out. So thank you for allowing me to drone on for an hour and a half. I'm going to stop the share. And yeah, leave it open for comments, questions. I wasn't able to really monitor the chat while I was presenting. So if you ask questions in the chat, I will definitely save the chat and get back to you with answers later. But if you want to re-ask them here, I'll stay as long as people want to ask questions.
I had ordered a muffaletta, Steve, so.
Okay, yeah, but did you get the $5 to it? Questions? Comments? I know it's a lot to absorb. I just kind of opened the fire hose on you all.
Well, in terms of paradigm, this is so harmonious with, like, you know, what, I mean, you and I have talked before a little bit, but, you know, this is just really harmonious with everything that, you know, I'm not just speaking for me. I mean, so many of us believe here about the way the digital world should work, and the you know, self-jurisdiction of one's digital self and the ability to, you know, consensually intermingle outward and define what comes in and filter it, you know, with a kind of pull model. It looks great. And my biggest questions are, you know, beyond my pay grade, but just how what you're doing and what, you know, Johannes is doing with the, you know, what's he calling it, Data Palace, and you know, there are aspects of this that touch on the what Brad's up to and what all of us are up to in different ways, and how do we get on the same page together and not, well, this is the way I do it. And
yeah no, that is, you know, so sort of a very central question, right? I think from my perspective, collaboration is very sensitive to timing. And so I know people that I'm 100% values aligned with, who are completely on board architecturally with similar thoughts. We've been trying to collaborate for about 5 years now. And it just hasn't lined up, right, with the maturity of our relative products and where we're at. And so I think I see that a lot in the collabathon with projects at different levels of maturity, right? And so my hope, and I see this happening, is that people will discover these collaborative opportunities when the timing is right. And I honor that. So if you found a collaborative opportunity, don't wait for the map, certainly, because that's why I was pretty clear that it's very early on, right? I hope that as the map prototype gets out there, and as Dawn starts to take shape, that some of the projects will find ways that we can integrate. So I'm looking at the ontological commenting, for example, and in the conversation that we had in the office hours earlier. I didn't have time in today's meeting to go into the details of how I am imagining managing data in Metaspace, but it seemed to be very aligned with what Marc-Antoine was talking about, and I think what Simon is talking about with ontological commenting. So that might be an early point of convergence. Beyond that, I think, as I mentioned, if people are, for example, using murmurations, anybody that's sort of externalizing their ontology, there may be some low-hanging fruit there to start adopting them through the adapters and so forth. So my main goal at this point is pretty much heads down, get the prototype built, and yeah, then, you know, social architects, the pro-social folks, you know, people with the memes that we need, let's see if we can represent those in the map. So that would be an interesting, design co-creation activity. So I can see lots of potential down the road. Not a lot immediate term. That's why I'm really focused on just trying to build this thing. I welcome other thoughts on that, though. It is sort of the central question.
Steve, I missed who you're building this with. Is it just you, or are there other people on the project?
Right now, I've got 2 other developers who are volunteering the time to help me build it. I did not go and will not go down the VC route to get it funded. I'm trying to get it to the point where it can be self-sustaining. There will be a time when I think some funding will be needed and sort of cross that funding model. But at this point, it's, as you can tell from the presentation, right? It's foilware. It's largely conceptual, and so it requires, there's a lot of cognitive burden to try and understand it. If I can just start building it and getting some visualizers out there, and so that's again the importance of the proof of concept, then it becomes more concrete. Then I hope to fire the imagination of what's possible by getting people to start to use it. And I'm hoping that that will then lead to some nurturing flows that allow us to expand the dev team. But right now it's a team of 3.
I'm curious what Art and Zippy and Jean and Sid and Holochain and even Andrea and Brett have their symphonics, and Nico Luck with his perspectivism, and the Atom ontology and stuff.
Yeah.
I'm assuming that since many of you are all there in Boulder, Denver area, what their thoughts are on this, or if you shared it with them. Holochain Dev Camp World is what was coming up for me.
Yeah, I did have a chance to share it at DWeb Camp verbally. I just met with Art and Zippy 2 days ago here at ETH Denver.
Yeah.
And I've known Nico and Brett for 7 years. In fact, part of the map was inspired by their early new map work.
Yeah.
So we're all, it's an example of that timing thing I talked about. We're all, I think, conceptually aligned. We all are being called with our own versions of the vision that aligns with our own skills and capacities, right?
Yes.
And so I'm just, honoring and supporting and respecting and putting love into the efforts that all of the people you mentioned are doing. And still looking forward to that convergence point in the future where, at least in my case, I have the map far enough along where maybe people can do something useful with it and to discover if there's a concrete opportunity. Harlan Wood and Adam Apollo is another, that's the person I had in mind when I said I've been trying to collaborate. I met Harlan and Adam both probably about 7 years ago now. And we keep talking about how we got to collaborate. And they have such beautiful visualizations. They're perfect candidates for, so they're almost, as soon as I get the Metaspace stuff ready, I'm going to reach out again to Harlan. We talk regularly, but I'll say, okay, I'm ready. Let's try it. So, and when it aligns with his cycles, maybe we can get some work in there.
Yeah, Adam definitely came up, and Harlan as well. Yeah, let me know when that pops off. Is Harlan also in Colorado? Because Adam's in Boulder, right?
Adam's in Colorado. Harlan is not, but he does visit here occasionally. Yeah.
Okay, well, great. Thanks for sharing. I'll pass to Adriana or Mark or whomever.
Yeah, looks like Adriana has your hand up, and then Mark next.
Wow, what a great project! I got in for the second half, and really, it's just like so impressive. And I really clicked with how aligned it is to the nature of the universe as well, in which of how our perspectives of reality, that it's very us-centric versus, I don't know, I think it's mimicking a lot, and it's very symbolic. I would love to explore, Steve, further on along the road, because I'm also on a developing stage with the Agami. The last bit that I will be doing is the maker space, which is a space that sits inside the community area. and it's meant to do a self-service of innovation. So it's for so basically with AI delivering all the prompts so that you can work your projects using the best practices of innovation. So it's like the same level that I would have given with a consulting project, but trying to automate that. And I'm leaving that for the end because there are issues that I've been dealing with in my head regarding how that would work in real life. On the sense that because it's going to be sitting inside the community space, it is open for my project to have you in it without me as a company knowing, so it just being left for it to just like to emerge. And I don't know why, but I'm feeling that maybe something like this we should explore to see if we can collaborate, because I find that the way that it tracks the information and it provides the ownership, it's very interesting. So yeah, I just wanted to leave that seed there to discuss further along.
Yeah, thanks, Adriana. And I loved what you shared about Agami today. And yeah, I do think there's synergistic opportunities if we can just find the right timing, to make it worthwhile. Yeah.
Thanks a lot for the presentation. Very, very beautiful way of putting this. As you were saying, and as Turquoise was saying, there's a lot of us trying to do this from various angles, and my goodness, we don't collaborate enough. And one thing I'm trying to do right now with another group of people is we all have the same diagnostic, let's put it out there, and we all have the ideas of different ideas of what are the requirements for this unifying platform or inter-platform is. And this is where I think it would be really worth spending time together thinking about, okay, why are we all doing our versions of this? Of course, because we're familiar with different tools, that's just accident, but also because we all have different visions of, oh, it also needs to do this, it also needs to do that, it also needs, and putting that, I think this is something we should come together with at the conceptual level. What are the conceptual key points that each of us sees in the architecture? I came up with the fluid concepts. Today, I have so many other components. You have thought about things I haven't. This is at a level at which I think we must come together. Over.
I agree. I'd welcome that. I'll also just quickly bring in, I was going to talk more about enterprise architecture because there's sort of a whole parallel story about enterprise architecture and how it weaves into this. But just quickly, when I began at US West, we did an inventory of their applications. They had 1,000 applications they used to run their business. And these were huge applications running on IBM mainframes, right? And they got there because they were in the era of function automation. And you automate this function because it's the low-hanging fruit, right? Let's go after that one. And that works so well, we'll do it again. Then we do it again and do it again, do it again. And each project would pick whatever the technology was at the time, whatever the hot technology was, right? So when you do that 1,000 times, you end up with this. They had more than 20 different operating systems. They had more than 20 different database systems, if you can imagine it. The user interface, they literally had to have swivel chairs because they had their 3270 terminal to talk to this IBM system and their BT100 to talk to that system and their X terminal to talk to that, right? So when their customer service reps would literally have these swivel chairs. I'm seeing a replay. So I've enjoyed 30 years career of watching enterprise architecture evolve in the commercial space. And I'm seeing many of these same problems being repeated in the web space. SSL being a perfect example, right? Companies figured that out 30 years ago. They still don't do a great job of executing it, but they at least figured out the concept. Maybe we should have one identity store and manage that carefully, rather than each app having its own identity store. But of course, on the web, you either have to go with each app in its own identity store, or you give your identity away to Google or LinkedIn or one of the BYOI identity providers. So solving for identity, solving for duplicate data, that US West example, they had customer data in more than 200 of their 1,000 systems. Same data. So we factored that out into shared subject-oriented databases. Anyway, it's a longer story than can get into now, but I think there is some relevance to the problem set that we're seeing as a group here and some of the challenges we're facing. I think those on the liminal web is in the era of function automation, coming up with pairwise, or point solutions to individual parts of the problem. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's a natural evolutionary stage. What I'm trying to do is create a platform that provides the infrastructure that allows us to design for collaboration out of the chute and create greater opportunities for collaboration. And figuring out what those requirements are and what the elements of that platform are is a great challenge. So I welcome your input and others' input on that.
Yeah, I think we need to share input on requirements. Like, for example,
Yes.
I don't believe personally in distinguishing nodes from relationships. And I could get into long reasons why, not here. but these aren't.
Thank you for sparing us, Mark. Steve, do you have a link to the PowerPoint or the slides? I just kind of want to, for my brain to absorb some of these architectures and some of the new language. If you have one to share that you feel comfortable with, I just want to look through them and see what the flow is going on with the wireframes. It was I was more listening to you and letting it wash over and taking in what I could at the time. But I know there's a ton that I didn't absorb that I'm just kind of letting it flow over me for the first time. And yeah, I can.
Yeah. I don't have a link to the slide deck yet. It was still being formed 5 minutes before the talk.
We did
Sound like me.
We did record this, right?
Yeah, but I did record the Zoom call. I'll make the recording available, and I will make the slide deck available too once I get into a shareable form.
Cool. It's also almost 7 my time, and I've been on Zooms all day, so I've got Zoom brain.
Yeah, totally. No, I
also
appreciate
trying to keep up.
I appreciate you hanging in there, and Gary, I don't know if your eyes are still open there, man, but thanks for hanging on. We should wrap this up shortly, but yeah, I appreciate everybody's engagement.
Can I ask you, what would be your ideal outcome from sharing this with this group?
That's a good question. As I mentioned, I think I'm trying to seed the consciousness. So the ideal outcome would be if people could feel into it and respond, either affirming the parts that they resonate with or challenging the parts that don't make sense. That would be ideal. If people see opportunities for near-term collaboration, I'm enjoying just the office hours and the other sessions in CTA, trying to learn more about what other people are doing, and I'm consistently impressed and inspired by what I discover. So I will continue to do that. I'd welcome feedback and welcome ideas such as what Marc Antoine raised about, maybe common requirements.
Yeah, and the last thing, I just appreciated how you started the presentation, just sharing your own journey coming into conscious awareness. And I feel like normalizing that event by sharing it at the beginning is a really important, it's very, very important. So thank you for doing that. And just if there's anything else you want to say just about what you're feeling into, how you listen, what's guiding you to the books or the whoever's that are influencing what you're doing. I would love that, because for me, that there's a vibration associated with that. And it's good to just like feel that with you before going.
Yeah, thank you for that, Kim, and thank you for the affirmation. I share that. I think each of us has a role to play, and that role is informed by our own personal journeys. And so to the extent that we share our journeys, it just helps people know where others are coming from and find those points of convergence. And so and thank you for that. And that might be a good note to close on.
May I just just one more thing. First of all, thank you very much for this. It was awesome, of course. And maybe in like so many other people with their own project, just trying to get something done. It is amazing, I have to say, how perfect you described what I didn't even think of in so many details, and how it all comes together. So yeah, thank you, and it's very, very inspiring. And what I wanted to ask us in this group, I've heard mentioned a couple of other projects and people involved in basically the same thing. So is there a chance for having a map, even if so virtual, or just a list of what we as a group here know what is happening in this space? And yeah, a map as a list of projects that exist and ideas that people think of, and people who are involved in those projects and those ideas. That would be a great start for possibility of collaboration between all of us.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know if you joined it when I gave a little bit of context. I know Don John was on, but yeah, this is being done as part of this Collabathon, which is a group of about 30 projects sponsored by the Collaborative Technology Alliance. And one of the projects in this CTA is an ecosystem mapping project. In fact, there's several projects that are doing different flavors of that to try and get, try and understand what is happening in this space. And yeah, I can connect you offline with that.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Just wanted to say thank you very much. Amazing. And just one point that I've talked to some of the key developers of Holochain 2 years ago, and I've challenged them, well, you are encoding in Rust a meta model, a conceptual model. And he said, yeah. Had we had the time, it would have been better if we just model it before rushing into code. So don't apologize for the conceptual nature, because that's, you got to get your concepts right. Then software can take care of itself. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yes. It's a nice balance. I'm a pretty big believer in agile methods, and my motto is think globally, act opportunistically. So I like to have the big picture, but then I like to make stuff that works. So trying to work both ends of that spectrum. But the concepts are critical, especially for new ground like this. I needed to spend some time thinking through how we could make this as simple and general enough in its foundation so that it is extensible in all the ways that people want to extend it, so we can leverage everyone's creativity.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Can I ask one question before we close, just because there are people here? If there was a way, because like I can feel, I could almost see like a whole sort of like week around projects like yours, Steve, where people were really presenting and then really spending the time to go through and do what Marc Antoine was asking. And it would be worthwhile to really think about what that could look like and how much time that would be for those of you that are in that, so that something like that could emerge from this process. Because it feels like, you talk about timing, and it feels like there are some maybe timings aligning, and how to make the most of that is something I have just a question about, so that the Collab-a-thon doesn't finish and everything just kind of, goes like that. So I don't have an answer. And those of you who might, it'd be great to think about that and share that next week.
Yeah, that sounds good. And yeah, so I share that hope. And I sense it will be true that the Collab-a-thon won't bring things to a close. If anything, it will just be a launch pad, right? But finding space for these longer conversations. I mean, I appreciate people hanging on this one. As you can tell, I haven't figured out how to tell this story in 30 seconds or a minute or 5 minutes yet. So this is about as concise as I've been able to tell it. And I still feel like I left huge parts of the story out, but yeah, so and I'm sure that's true for the other projects as well. In these group meetings, you only have a chance to sort of talk in a very, very limited and abstract way about, all the rich work that you're doing. So finding those opportunities when we're all busy trying to realize our visions, that's the challenge. But Collab-a-thon is helping with that.
Yeah, I'd love to share something if maybe it's helpful for you or the rest of the group. The most salient and important thing for me was the beginning about your story
Mm-hmm.
and where your heart was.
Mhm.
I've probably been in, I don't know, hundreds of these conversations with really complex architectures about new technologies, and I was in the Holochain Dev Camp a couple years back, so I'm familiar with the Holochain architecture and seen the things that Zippy's built, and so just seen the things a lot of people have built. And the thing that I'm taking away, like I remember a few of the frameworks and the schemas and some of the language, and which I'd have to ask you about, well, what do you mean by this meme? That I didn't want to really and what are you saying here, and all of those things. But the thing that I'm taking away is about who you are, and just the felt sense of okay, Steve's a good guy. He's got this, where you were orienting in the beginning around consciousness and nature and technology. And I think he said something to the effect that there's no type of technologies that's going to fix this. There were just some parts of how you were saying things in the beginning that I'm yep, this could very well be the thing, and it could, intersect with every other thing, and it could be copies of this, and maybe it's not the thing. I don't know any of that. And I'm sure it's great, and it's way more well thought out for probably decades than I have. But the thing that I'm taking away is feeling closer connected to you in your experience, in who you are as a person. And just in my mind, I have more of a sense of who Steve is, and that there's a little bit of trust there. And then I'll look over some of the tech stuff later in the thing and figure out what pardon my French, what the hell you're talking about. What the heck? What in the complexity is this wizard saying? I'd love to look at it. And so that's the piece, that beginning piece, when I'm okay, my nervous system's calm. I feel good. I feel in resonance and in consonance with this. Let's look at more of it. And I know there's 10 others, somewhat similar or overlapping wizards I know with similar edge thinking, and count Steve in with one of those, with that cohort of wonderful beings. And that was enough for me here.
Thank you.
Thank you for putting that at the front too. Very important. Kim mentioned it. I'm double clicking on that.
All right. Thank you for that. I feel the same way, by the way, in the meetings I've been with you, and just haven't had a chance to go into any depth in any of the work that you're doing, but I immediately connected just with the heart and vibe that you're expressing it with. So yeah, let's get together for coffee sometime. All right, everyone. Well, this has been a rich session. Thank you all for hanging in there. And I think we'll wrap it up here. Thanks again.
All right.